No one noticed the cave at first. In December of 1904, a geologist named Roland Fitch trudged through knee-deep snow along a limestone ridge in northern Wyoming, 3 miles west of what remained of the town of Delward. He was not looking for shelter. He was looking for rock samples. His boots punched through the crusted surface with each step, and the cold, 40 below with the wind, had long since stopped feeling like temperature and started feeling like intention. He almost walked past the entrance entirely. It was narrow, half hidden behind a stand of old-growth Douglas fir whose branches held snow in silence. He stepped inside out of habit, the habit of a man who had spent 20 years noting what others walked past. And then he stopped. He took out his thermometer and held it at arm's length. 51 degrees. He checked it twice. Outside, the mercury had not climbed above -24 since Tuesday. Inside this cave, in the dead of a Wyoming December, with no fire, no lamp, no living soul, 51 degrees. Roland Fitch was not a man given to wonder. He had surveyed mines in Pennsylvania, limestone formations in Ohio, granite shelves in Montana. He had measured things his whole life and trusted what the numbers told him. He wrote in his field notebook that evening, by candlelight, in the careful hand of someone setting down a fact he could not yet explain. Structurally impossible by any standard I was taught, but a woman with 2 children and $47 had understood it perfectly. She had understood it at a time when her entire town was trying to take those children away. There is one more thing Roland Fitch recorded in his notebook that December afternoon, though he did not know what to make of it. On the wooden frame beside the cold masonry stove, carved with a blade into the grain of the wood, were 2 initials and a date. H.B. December 1891. They did not belong to the woman who built this place. They belonged to the man who had tried hardest to destroy her. That story begins 13 years earlier, on a morning in April of 1891, when the Powder River took the only man Clara Voss had ever depended on. Edmund Voss was not a man who said much. He was steady in the way that certain men are steady. Not through effort, but through nature, the way a good fence post is steady, the way a stone step holds its ground through 40 winters without being thanked for it. He loved his wife and his children in the same manner, quietly, structurally, without calling attention to the work. He fixed things before Clara noticed they were broken. He carved a wooden horse for Birch without mentioning it was a birthday gift. He let their daughter Ada tally nails in his work belt while he built, teaching her numbers through the weight of iron in her small hands. When he came home late from hauling timber, Clara left a bowl of porridge warming on the stove, and he ate it without a word, because both of them understood that love in a place like northern Wyoming was not about words. It was about showing up. They had built their life together, one board at a time. On the morning of April 14th, Edmund needed timber from the far bank of the Powder River. Spring melt had been running for 3 weeks. The river looked calm that day, its surface flat and bright under pale April sunlight. Clara stood on the bank and watched him prepare the crossing. Something about the water unsettled her. It was too smooth, too quiet, like a page laid flat to hide everything written beneath it. "Looks peaceful," she said. Edmund nodded. He did not look back. The Powder River had a reputation that newcomers learned too late. During spring melt, the surface could appear glassy and still, while the undercurrent ran with the force of a freight train. Edmund was halfway across when it caught him. He went under without a sound. One moment he was there, waist deep, moving steadily. The next moment, the river closed over him, like a door being shut from the other side. They found his body 2 miles downstream against a fallen cottonwood. His hands were still gripping the rope he had carried. Clara identified him by his boots and by the scar on his left forearm where a logging chain had caught him 3 years before. She buried him herself. At the graveside, after the neighbors drifted away in ones and twos, an old man made his way to Clara through the April mud. His name was August Keller. He was 78 years old, the oldest person in Delaware, a man who had survived more winters in Wyoming than anyone cared to count. He lived quietly on the east edge of town and attended community events with the detached politeness of someone who had outlived most of the people worth talking to. He took Clara's hand. His grip was dry and certain. "Stone holds longer than wood, girl," he said. "My grandfather knew it in the mines. The earth never lies about what it keeps." Clara did not understand. She thanked him and watched him walk away through the rain, his coat dark with water, his steps unhurried. But the sentence stayed. Summer passed. Sympathy faded the way summer wildflowers fade. Slowly at first, then all at once, until one day you look around and the color is simply gone. The women who had brought food stopped coming. The men who had offered to split wood moved on to their own wood piles. It was not cruelty. It was the arithmetic of survival in a place where everyone had enough trouble carrying their own weight. Clara worked as a seamstress, mending trousers for loggers and sewing shirts for trappers who passed through on their way north. The pay was enough for flour and salt pork. It was not enough for 9 cords of firewood. She did the math one August evening at the kitchen table with Ada asleep and Birch curled beside the stove, his wooden horse tucked under one arm. She counted every coin in the tin box, $47, estimated every shirt she could sew before November, and came up short. Not slightly short, desperately short. She would have enough wood to last until January, maybe February if she rationed carefully. After that, nothing. That night, Ada woke from a half-sleep and asked the question that changed everything. "Mama, will we freeze like the cutter's horse?" The cutter horse had been found stiff in its stall the previous January, on a morning when the temperature had dropped past 30 below. Every child in Delaware knew the story. It had become the way children in cold country spoke about the worst thing they could imagine. Clara did not answer. She pulled the blanket higher and kissed her daughter's forehead and said good night. But she did not sleep. She lay in the dark for a long time, turning a single sentence over and over in her mind. The earth never lies about what it keeps. Before first light, she dressed in the dark, told no one, and walked west. The walk took just over an hour. She followed the deer trail along the base of the ridge, through stands of ponderosa pine, past gray outcroppings of limestone that jutted from the hillside like the knuckles of a buried fist. The morning was cold for August, the kind of cold that reminds you what is coming even while the grass is still green. She was not in a rush. She was thinking, and the thinking required space. She remembered the cave. She had noticed it 2 summers before, while picking choke cherries along the ridge, a narrow opening in the limestone, facing southeast, half hidden by Douglas fir. She had stepped inside briefly, felt the cool air on her skin, and walked back out because she had berries to pick and children to feed. Now she returned with different eyes. The entrance was exactly as she remembered. The chamber beyond it opened to nearly 20 feet across, with a ceiling that rose high at the center before tapering toward the back. The cave ran 40 feet deep, dry, the back wall clean and solid underfoot. Clara pressed her palm flat against the limestone. The stone was cold. Cold in August. Cold in the middle of a day when the sun had been climbing for hours. She held her hand there and felt it. Not the cold of winter, but something older. Something patient. And she heard her father's voice the way you hear things that were said to you long ago. Not as memory, but as understanding arriving late. Rock doesn't lose heat, Clara. It just hasn't found any yet. She had spent 32 years watching people fight the cold the same way. Bigger fires, more wood, thicker blankets, always pouring heat into the air and watching it vanish upward through a chimney and out into the open sky. Always the same losing equation. Nobody ever asked where the heat was going. She stood in the entrance of the cave and looked at the chamber the earth had spent 10,000 years hollowing out of solid limestone. She looked at 60 feet of ancient rock on every side, above, below, behind. Rock that did not care about wind chill or firewood prices or the opinion of neighbors. She was not looking at a hole in a hill. She was looking at 4 walls that nature had already built. All she needed to do was finish the inside. Clara Voss turned and walked back down the ridge toward her children. She had work to do. She did not tell anyone what she was planning. That was the first decision, and in some ways, the most important one. Delward was a town of 43 families spread across a few square miles of river bottom and rolling grassland. A general store, a church that doubled as a meeting hall, a sawmill that operated 6 months of the year, a blacksmith, a schoolhouse where children of all ages shared a single room and a single stove that never kept the back row warm. There was no doctor. The nearest one was in Casper, 2 days by wagon in good weather and unreachable in winter. There was no telegraph office, no railroad spur. For 5 months of every year, Delward might as well have been on the moon. In a place that small, a plan announced was a plan argued over. And Clara did not have time for arguments. She had September, October, and the first 2 weeks of November before the ground froze too hard to work. 11 weeks, if she was lucky with the weather. She intended to use every one of them. She began in the last week of August, before the mornings turned cold enough to see her breath. The sawmill discarded warped and knotted lumber in a pile behind the main building. Boards too crooked to sell, too solid to rot. Clara had been walking past that pile for 3 years without seeing it. Now she saw it clearly. She borrowed a handcart from the widow Greer, who asked no questions, and began hauling boards to the ridge before sunrise, 3 loads a morning, returning home in time to start the sewing work that paid for their flour. Ada came on the 2nd day. She appeared at the cave entrance while Clara was measuring the chamber with a length of rope, and she did not ask what her mother was doing. She simply picked up the other end of the rope and held it steady against the far wall. That was Ada. She observed first. She committed second. Once she committed, she did not waver. Birch came too, toddling along the deer trail with his wooden horse tucked under one arm and a small bag of pebbles in his other hand. Pebbles he had been collecting all summer, chosen for their shape or their color or the particular way they fit in his palm. He arranged them in patterns on the cave floor while the women worked, narrating quiet stories to himself that neither Clara nor Ada could fully hear. This was enough. His presence was enough. The sound of his voice, even at a distance, reminded Clara why the work mattered. She framed the room 15 feet back from the entrance, where the ceiling was still high enough to stand. 14 feet long, 10 feet wide, 8 feet tall. She worked from memory and from the things her father had told her in the darkness of Pennsylvania mine shafts when she was young enough to think that fathers knew everything, and old enough to understand that some of what they knew was worth remembering. Her father, Wilhelm Voss, had spent 30 years as a mining engineer in the coal fields east of Pittsburgh. He had gone down into the earth thousands of times and come back up thousands of times, and what he had learned in those shafts was not only how rock behaved, but why. He understood heat the way most men understood money, as something that moved, that could be directed, that was always going somewhere, whether you intended it to or not. He had taught Clara the principle on a winter afternoon when she was 11 years old. They were standing in a mine entrance, and she had noticed that the air inside was warmer than the air outside, even though there was no fire. "Why is it warmer in here, Papa?" He had crouched beside her and pressed his palm flat against the shaft wall. "Feel that?" he said. She felt it. The rock was neither warm nor cold. It was the same temperature it had always been. "Rock is slow," he said. "The sun heats the surface in summer. The rock absorbs it. By winter, that heat is still in there, moving down through the stone, releasing itself a little at a time. The earth runs on a different clock than we do. Slower, more patient. If you learn to work with that patience instead of against it, you will never be cold." She had not thought about that conversation in years. Standing in the cave in August of 1891, she thought about nothing else. The problem with every cabin in Delward, with every plank-walled structure she had ever lived in, was not a lack of fire. It was that heat escaped faster than fire could replace it. Flames roared up chimneys and vanished into the open sky. Thin walls gave warmth to the wind as fast as the stove could produce it. People responded by burning more wood, working harder, feeding bigger fires, never stopping to ask the question her father had taught her to ask. Where is the heat going? Stone was different. Stone absorbed heat slowly and held it stubbornly and released it gradually over hours. A cave made of limestone, surrounded by 60 feet of solid rock on every side, was a natural insulator of extraordinary power. Whatever heat you put inside would stay inside, held by millions of tons of ancient stone that did not care about blizzards or wind chill or the price of firewood. The stone never lies about what it keeps, and what it keeps is everything you give it. Clara built double walls of vertical planks, sealed with clay and dried moss on the inside, then 12 inches of open space, then a second wall beyond. She packed the gap loosely with dried grass and pine needles. Trapped air, her father had told her, slowed heat transfer better than solid wood ever could. The floor came next. Flat stones lay directly on the cave floor, creating a dense thermal base. Above that, a raised plank floor with a 4-inch gap beneath it. Cold air would settle into the gap and stay there. Warm air would rise and stay where people lived. She built the entrance at the back of a 5-foot vestibule with its own door. 2 doors, one after the other, with a buffer of still air between them. Cold drafts would lose most of their force before reaching the living space. And at the back wall, where the limestone ran deepest into the ridge, she planned the thing that would make all the difference. Not a fireplace, a masonry stove. She had seen one years before in the home of a German immigrant family south of Casper, and she had never forgotten it. The firebox was small. The fire burned fast and hot. But instead of sending all that heat straight up a chimney, the hot gases traveled through a series of channels built into surrounding stonework, giving up their warmth to the mass before finally exiting through a flue. The chimney followed a natural fissure in the cave ceiling, carefully sealed so smoke could escape, but heat could not rush out with it. She traded 6 weeks of sewing work for salvaged fire bricks from a collapsed forge. She mixed clay and river sand and horsehair into mortar. She built the stove by hand, channel by channel, testing each joint before laying the next course of brick. Behind the stove, she mortared river stones thick against the limestone wall, building a radiant surface that would absorb heat during each burn and release it slowly through the night. 4 sources of retained warmth: the stove itself, the radiant wall, the stone floor beneath the planks, and the cave. Layers within layers, each one holding what the others gave. She was 2 weeks into the work when Harlan Briggs came to look. She heard him before she saw him. His boots on the rock were deliberate, unhurried, the walk of a man who has decided he is right before he has seen what he is right about. He stood at the cave entrance for a long moment, hands on his hips, and then stepped inside. Harlan Briggs was 47 years old, the best carpenter in Delward and the surrounding country, and he knew it the way a man knows a thing he has never had reason to question. He had built more structures in northern Wyoming than any man alive. Proper cabins, square corners, plank walls, chimneys that drew clean. When people needed a roof that would hold through winter, they came to Harlan. And Harlan delivered. He had earned his reputation over 20 years of honest, skilled work, and that reputation had become something more than reputation. It had become identity. It had become the lens through which he saw everything, including what Clara Voss was building inside a hole in a limestone hill. He walked the length of the unfinished room without speaking. He ran his hand along the double wall framing. He crouched and examined the base where the stone floor would meet the raised planking. He stood in the location where the masonry stove would go and looked at the fissure in the ceiling with the focused skepticism of a man looking for the flaw he already knows is there. Then he turned and looked at Clara. "Underground doesn't breathe right," he said. "Moisture collects on the stone. Mold follows. Come spring melt, water will find every crack. She'll be swimming before she's sleeping." He was not speaking to Clara. He was speaking to the cave, to the framing, to the concept itself, as though Clara were an incidental detail. "Those children deserve a proper roof," he said, and walked out. That evening, at the general store, Harlan held court. 3 men listened while he laid out his case in the calm, measured voice of a man whose authority had never been seriously challenged. An underground structure in a climate like Wyoming's. Moisture, mold, the spring melt. He ticked off each problem like items on an invoice. The men nodded. Harlan's logic made sense. It always did. He was a craftsman, and craftsmen understood materials. What Harlan did not understand, what his certainty would not allow him to consider, was that someone with no formal training and no professional reputation might understand them differently, might understand them better. He did not examine this possibility because it did not occur to him that it was a possibility. By the following Sunday, most of Delward had heard some version of what Harlan Briggs had said. The versions grew louder and less accurate with each retelling, the way gossip always does in small places. That widow had lost her mind. Clara Voss was dragging her children underground like some kind of animal. Ada heard it first. She was at the well, filling a bucket, when Harlan was speaking to a group of men near the general store steps. His voice carried. Ada stood very still with both hands on the bucket handle and listened to every word. She carried the water home without spilling a drop. She set the bucket down and looked at her mother with the flat, careful expression she reserved for difficult information. "Mr. Briggs says you are putting us in danger," she said. "He says if something happens to us in there, it will be your fault. He said it in front of Mr. Tanner and the Hollis brothers." Clara dried her hands on her apron. She looked at her daughter for a long moment. "Help me pack the clay," she said. They went back to the ridge. The first night the flue jammed. Clara was not ready for it. It happened in early November, 3 weeks after she had moved the children and their few belongings into the shelter. The room was finished. Walls, floor, stove, vestibule. And in the first weeks, it had performed almost exactly as she had calculated. 2 logs in the morning, 1 before bed, and the room held between 72 and 80 degrees through the night. Outside, the temperature had dropped to 15 below. Inside, Birch slept on the warm floor without a blanket pulled over his shoulders. Ada read by candlelight until her eyes grew heavy. Clara sewed. It was the closest thing to peace she had felt since April. Then, at 2 in the morning on a Tuesday in November, she woke to the smell of smoke, not the clean, faint smell of a well-drying stove. This was thick and acrid and wrong. She was on her feet before her mind caught up with her body. In the dim glow of the dying fire, she could see smoke curling from the stove joints, filling the upper reaches of the room with a gray haze that was dropping lower by the second. The natural fissure in the cave ceiling, the one she had sealed carefully and used as her flue, was blocked. Ice, most likely. The cold outside had been brutal for days, and condensation from the flue gases had been building up. She had not yet learned to watch for this. She was learning now. She had seconds to decide. Opening the vestibule doors would clear the smoke, but at 15 below zero, cold air would flood in and drain the room of every degree she had stored in the walls and floor and stone over 3 weeks of careful burning. Everything she had built, every hour of retained warmth, would begin bleeding away. Keeping the doors closed meant the smoke would thicken. Birch was already coughing. A wet, startled sound from the blankets. Clara grabbed the bucket of sand she kept beside the stove. She had placed it there on the first day, not because she expected trouble, but because she had been taught by a man who expected everything to expect something. She smothered the fire. The flames died. The smoke stopped increasing. She cracked the outer vestibule door just inches. Cold air seeped in along the floor, dense and heavy, nudging the smoke back toward the entrance. The 2-door system worked the way she had designed it to work. Outer door cracked, inner door fully open, creating a slow current that moved smoke out without letting the full force of the cold rush in. It took 20 minutes to clear the air, 20 minutes of Birch coughing, Ada holding a damp cloth over her brother's face, Clara standing at the vestibule adjusting the outer door by fractions of an inch, managing the airflow the way her father had taught her to manage a mine shaft ventilation problem, with patience and small corrections rather than force. The smoke cleared, but the fire was out. And now the cold had begun to work on the room. Clara wrapped both children in everything they owned. She put on her coat, her gloves, her wool hat. She took the iron rod she used for stoking and stepped out through the vestibule into the darkness, 40 below. The stars were hard and white, and the wind moved across the ridge with a sound like something tearing. She climbed the slope by memory, searching for the fissure where her flue exited the stone. She found it by the faint smell of char. Ice had sealed it, a plug of frozen condensation that had built up over days and finally closed the gap completely. She swung the iron rod. The first strike sent shock up both arms. The second cracked the ice. The third broke it open. She cleared the debris with her hands because the rod was too clumsy for the final pieces, and the cold bit into her fingers with a specific, focused malice that made her think of nothing except finishing the job. She did not count the minutes. She knew she could not afford to. When she crawled back through the vestibule and reached for the matchbox, her hands would not obey. She fumbled the box. Matches scattered across the floor. She gathered them in shaking fists, pressed one between her thumb and finger, and tried to strike. Her hands spasmed. The match broke. She reached for another. It was then that Ada was beside her. The girl said nothing. She took her mother's shaking hands between her own small palms and held them, just held them, pressing gently, steadily, until the trembling slowed. Then she released them, picked up a match from the floor, and struck it against the box. It did not catch. She struck again. The third match flared. Ada cupped the flame with her free hand and touched it to the kindling Clara had laid hours before. The tinder caught. The small sticks caught. The split log caught. Fire again. Clara sat on the floor beside her daughter and could not speak. She put her arm around Ada and felt the girl lean into her, 9 years old, steady as limestone. And they sat together while the stove began its work, and the room began, slowly and patiently, to remember what warmth felt like. By morning, the room was 71 degrees. It was 2 days after the flu incident that Dora Spence came to the cave. Dora was 38, the wife of a mill foreman, with 3 children of her own, and a generous heart that functioned best when generosity was uncomplicated. She had been Clara's closest friend in Delward for 4 years. She had brought soup in the weeks after Edmund's death, watched Birch when Clara needed to work, and sat with her on Sunday afternoons drinking coffee while the children played. She was kind without performance and warm without calculation, and she had shown up consistently in all the small ways that matter between neighbors. She arrived at the cave entrance on a gray Thursday afternoon, with her face tight with the particular anxiety of a woman who cares about her friend, but cares more about what people think. "They're talking, Clara," she said. She would not come inside. She stood in the entrance with her coat pulled close. "Harlan has been to see Reverend Hatch. He told the Reverend he has concerns about the children's welfare. You know what that means." Clara understood exactly what it meant. A widow alone, moving her children underground, refusing a proper home. In Delward, it would not take much for someone to argue, formally, legally, before a judge in Casper, that the children needed to be placed with a proper family. A family that lived above ground, behind plank walls, under a chimney that drew clean. "Harlan Briggs is not a vindictive man," Dora continued more quietly. "He genuinely believes you are putting them at risk. I know he does," Clara said. "Then come back to town. You can stay in the Greer place through winter. People would help." Clara looked at her friend for a long time. Dora's eyes were earnest and frightened and already halfway decided, the way a person's eyes look when they are hoping you will give them permission to stop helping. "Thank you for telling me," Clara said. Straight. Dora left. She did not come back. The friendship did not end with a confrontation or a slammed door. It ended with distance, with Dora crossing to the other side of Delward's main road when she saw Clara coming, not out of hatred, but out of the particular cowardice of someone who cannot bear to be associated with a decision the town has already judged. It was not malice. It was the arithmetic of social survival, and Clara had lived in small places long enough to know that the arithmetic almost always won. The custody letter arrived on a Monday in late November. A rider from the county seat brought it to the cave entrance and held it out without meeting Clara's eyes. She took it. She read it standing in the vestibule, with Birch playing behind her and Ada watching from the corner of the room. Reverend Solomon Hatch, acting on concerns raised by community members, had petitioned the county judge to conduct a welfare review of the Voss children. The judge had granted the petition. Reverend Hatch would conduct a formal inspection of the children's living situation within 3 weeks. If the Reverend determined that the conditions were unsuitable, temporary guardianship of Ada and Birch Voss would be transferred to the Briggs household pending further review. The Briggs household. Harlan Briggs. Clara read the letter twice. Then she folded it carefully and placed it in the tin box. The tin box that held $47. The tin box that had held, underneath the money and the sewing receipts and the dried flour Edmund had tucked inside as a joke on their 3rd anniversary. A letter she had not yet opened. A letter her father had written to Edmund before their wedding, in 1882, that Edmund had placed in the box and never mentioned, and that Clara had not been able to bring herself to look at since April. She closed the lid. She put Birch to bed. She waited until Ada's breathing slowed and deepened, and the room was quiet except for the stove and the wind outside on the ridge. Then she sat alone. She did the calculation she had been refusing to do. If she went back to town, to the Greer house, to a proper roof, to visible respectability, Harlan would have no grounds to pursue the petition. The children would be safe from the courts. She would lose the cave, lose the work of 3 months, lose the one thing she had built with her own hands from nothing. But the children would be safe. Except they wouldn't. Not really. Not through a Wyoming winter in a cabin that bled heat through its north wall. Not with a woodpile that couldn't be sustained on a seamstress's wages. The arithmetic of survival was as clear as the arithmetic of social pressure, and both of them were telling her the same brutal thing. She could not win. She sat with that for a long time. Then Ada moved in her sleep, turning toward the warmth of the stove, and said something low and indistinct that Clara almost did not catch. Papa said the stone remembers. Clara did not know if Ada was dreaming of Edmund or dreaming of nothing, or if children sometimes say, in sleep, the things that need to be said. She did not know, and it did not matter. She sat with the words the way she had sat with August Keller's words at the graveside, holding them at arm's length, and then, slowly, letting them in. She did not go anywhere. She went to sleep beside her children, and in the morning she added 2 logs to the stove and braided Ada's hair and helped Birch find the red pebble he had lost behind the stove. And she kept going because there was nothing else to do, and because stopping was not something she knew how to do, and because the walls she had built were warm. It was Levi Marsh who found the dog. Levi was 52, a trapper who lived alone in a one-room cabin 4 miles north of Delward and came to town only when he needed salt or tobacco or a new trap spring. He was lean and unhurried and had the particular quality of stillness that comes to men who spend most of their time outdoors and alone. Not the stillness of passivity, but the stillness of someone who has learned that patience is the most effective tool he owns. He had noticed the smoke from the cave ridge weeks before. He had not mentioned it to anyone. He had left a dressed rabbit hanging from a nail at the cave entrance one morning without knocking, without leaving his name, and gone back to his traps. Clara knew it was him. She did not mention it either. Some forms of generosity work best when neither party acknowledges them. Levi found Copper at the edge of the Delward dumping ground on a Tuesday in early December. The dog was about 2 years old, a pale gold color beneath the filth, with one ear that stood straight and one that folded forward. He had been there for at least 3 days, too weak to move far, surviving on whatever scraps blew in from the dump. Levi brought him to the cave because it was closer than his own cabin and because the dog needed warmth immediately. Ada opened the door and saw the dog in Levi's arms and said nothing for a long moment. Then she said, "Can we keep him?" Clara looked at the dog. The dog looked at Clara with the patient, assessing gaze of an animal that has learned not to expect much and is therefore not disappointed but not yet convinced. "We barely have enough for ourselves," Clara said. "He doesn't eat much," Ada said. "He's mostly bones." "Ada, Mama." Ada's voice was level, without pleading, which was somehow more persuasive than pleading. "He's been left too. He knows what that's like." Clara looked at the dog for another moment. Then she stepped aside. Copper walked into the cave, found the warmest spot on the stone floor beside the masonry stove, lowered himself onto it with the careful deliberateness of a creature making a considered decision, and exhaled so deeply that Birch, sitting 3 feet away, looked up from his pebbles and laughed. It was the first time Birch had laughed since April. Clara watched her son's face, open and bright and wholly present, the way a child's face is when something has temporarily interrupted their grief. And she felt something loosen in her chest that she had not known was wound tight. "All right," she said, to no one in particular. Reverend Solomon Hatch arrived on a Thursday in mid-December, in the middle of the morning, announced by Copper's low growl from the stove side of the room. He was 55, a tall man with a measured way of moving, careful with his words in the way that men are careful with words when they have spent decades aware that words, in their profession, carry unusual weight. He had been Delward's minister for 14 years and had learned over those 14 years that most conflicts between people came not from malice, but from fear dressed up as principle. He was not a cruel man. He was a cautious one, and he had allowed Harlan Briggs's certainty to fill the space that his own uncertainty had left open. He came to the cave expecting what Harlan had described: suffering, damp, children shivering in a stone tomb. He stepped through the vestibule and into the room. He stopped walking. The thermometer on the wall read 82 degrees. Ada sat at the small table with a book open in front of her, her coat hanging on a peg by the door, her cheeks flushed with the comfortable color of a child who has been warm for a long time. Birch sat cross-legged on the floor, arranging his pebbles into the outline of a house, narrating quietly to Copper, who lay beside him with his chin on his forepaws, and his eyes moving between the boy and the Reverend with the calm attentiveness of a dog who has decided this visitor is probably not a threat. Hatch took off his coat. He was not cold. He had not been not cold indoors since October. He walked the room slowly. He pressed his palm against the double wall and felt warmth radiating from the wood. He crouched and touched the plank floor and felt warmth coming up through the boards from the stone beneath. He stood before the masonry stove and studied it. The small firebox, the sealed channel openings, the radiant wall of river stones behind it. "How much wood?" he asked. "2 logs most days," Clara said. "3 if I'm cooking something slow." He looked at the stove. The surface was calm. Not the screaming, glowing iron of an overworked box stove, but something quieter, something that had already done its work and was holding the result. "How long does the heat last after the fire dies?" Clara opened the stove door. Faint coals glowed inside. "This fire has been burning 6 hours," she said. "I'll add 1 log before bed. The room holds above 70 until morning. If I let it go out completely, it drops to 65 and holds there. 65 degrees with no fire in a Wyoming December." Hatch looked at Ada, who had not looked up from her book. He looked at Birch, who was explaining to Copper the structural advantages of the pebble arrangement he had just completed. He looked at Clara, who was standing near the stove with her hands still and her face composed, waiting. He did not say anything for a long time. When he put his coat back on and stepped toward the vestibule, he paused. He turned back, not quite meeting Clara's eyes. "I will complete my report," he said, "and deliver it to the judge by Friday." He left. Copper watched him go. Then the dog put his chin back on his forepaws and closed his eyes. Outside, the December sky pressed low and gray over the limestone ridge, and the wind moved through the Douglas fir with a sound that had begun, in recent days, to carry something in it, a particular edge, a particular density, that Clara recognized from the barometer her father had left her, which had been falling steadily for 2 days and showed no sign of stopping. But that was a problem for another week. Tonight, the stove held. The walls held. Ada read until her candle burned low, and Birch fell asleep mid-sentence, his hand still resting on the pebble house he had built on the warm floor. Clara added 1 log, checked the flue, pulled the blanket up over her son's shoulders. Somewhere out on the ridge, the wind was building toward something. Inside, 80 degrees held steady, and Birch Voss slept without shivering for the 53rd night in a row. The report came on a Friday. Reverend Hatch delivered it himself, on foot, in the kind of gray December morning that arrives in northern Wyoming without ceremony. Sky the color of old pewter. Air so dry it cracked the skin at the corners of your mouth. Wind moving across the ridge in long, patient sweeps that took the temperature with it when it went. Clara was sewing when she heard his boots on the rock outside. Copper lifted his head from the floor, assessed the footsteps, and settled back down without growling. That was how Clara knew it was not Harlan. Hatch came through the vestibule and stood in the entrance of the room with his hat in his hands. He was not a man who fidgeted, but he turned the hat slowly between his fingers as he spoke, which told Clara everything she needed to know about what the visit had cost him. He had delivered the report to the county judge that morning. He read the relevant passage from memory, in the flat, careful voice of a man reciting something he has committed to precision, because precision was the only protection he had left. The children are warm, well fed, and properly taught. The structure, though unconventional, maintains a stable interior temperature superior to most dwellings in the surrounding area. I find no grounds for removal. Clara set down her needle. Outside, somewhere on the ridge, a Clark's nutcracker called twice and went silent. Harlan will contest it, Hatch said. He told me so this morning, before I filed. He'll write to the county seat himself. He has standing, and he has friends there. I know. Hatch looked at his hat. I want you to know that He stopped. Started again. I was given a version of the situation that I did not question as thoroughly as I should have. I allowed another stop. I allowed another man's certainty to substitute for my own judgment. That is a failure of my office, and I will not repeat it. Clara looked at him for a long moment. He was a man in his middle 50s who had just said the hardest thing he knew how to say, and he had said it plainly, without dressing it up. That counted for something. You wrote the report you believed, she said. That's what I needed. I almost didn't. The words sat in the warm air between them. I know, Clara said, but you did. Hatch put his hat back on and left. Copper watched him go. Ada, who had been sitting very still with her book open and unread on the table, waited until his footsteps faded entirely before she looked up. Is it over? She asked. For now, Clara said, and picked up her needle. She found the letter that same evening. She had opened the tin box to count what remained of the $47. 31 now, after the fire bricks and the clay and the small necessities that winter demanded. And she had lifted out the familiar layers. The coins, the sewing receipts, the dried flour Edmund had put there as a joke, still holding its shape after 9 years. And beneath all of it, the letter. She had known it was there. She had known since the day she had packed the box and felt it under her fingers and closed the lid quickly, the way you close a door on a room you are not yet ready to enter. It was addressed in her father's handwriting to Edmund Voss, dated the spring of 1882, the season before their wedding. Edmund had placed it in the box and never mentioned it, and she had never asked, and now Edmund was gone, and asking was no longer possible. She sat beside the stove with the envelope in her hands for a long time. Copper moved from the children's blankets and settled beside her feet. The fire ticked softly in the masonry channels. She opened it. Her father's handwriting was precise and slightly formal, the hand of an engineer who had spent decades writing reports and had carried the habit into his personal correspondence. He wrote about Edmund with the careful approval of a man who did not give approval easily. He wrote about marriage in the practical terms of someone who understood that love was the beginning of a thing, not the whole of it. And then, near the end, in the same unembellished hand, he wrote this: I conducted a survey of the limestone ridge 3 miles west of the Powder River in the autumn of 1872 for a company that subsequently decided against the site. The ridge holds nothing of commercial value, but I found there a chamber I have never seen equaled in my years underground. Dry, deep, oriented southeast, with a natural fissure that would serve as a perfect flue. The thermal mass alone would hold 40 degrees of differential without any fire at all. I thought of it again last week, and found myself wishing I had bought that land when I had the chance. If you ever need shelter that the earth itself will defend, Edmund, you will find it there. I suspect you will never need it, but I wanted you to know. Clara read the letter twice, then a third time. Her father had stood in that cave 19 years ago. He had understood exactly what it was. He had written it down and given it to Edmund, and Edmund had placed it in the tin box under the dried flower, and neither of them had ever mentioned it. She was not sitting in a cave she had found by accident. She was sitting in a cave her father had left her, the only way he had known how to leave it. Quietly, practically, in the form of information tucked inside a letter inside a box, waiting for the day it was needed. The stone never lies about what it keeps. She folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the box, on top of everything else this time, where she could find it without lifting anything away. The barometer fell steadily through the last week of December. Clara's father had given her the instrument along with the letter, though separately and years later, a brass aneroid barometer in a mahogany case, the kind used in mine operations to monitor atmospheric pressure before blasting. She had hung it on the cave wall beside the thermometer the day she moved in, partly from habit and partly because her father had told her once that a woman who watches the pressure will never be surprised by what the sky does. She watched it now. It had been falling for 3 days, slowly at first, then, with increasing urgency, the needle moving with the particular purpose of something that has made up its mind. On the morning of January 4th, it dropped 12 points between dawn and midday. Clara stood in front of it for a long time without moving. Copper had not settled in 2 days. He paced the length of the room, turned, paced back, turned again. Not frantic, but persistent, the way a dog moves when something in the air has changed in a way that human senses cannot register, but animal ones cannot ignore. He lay down and then stood up again within minutes. He stationed himself at the vestibule door, and then returned to the stove, and then went back to the door. Ada watched him with the particular attention she gave to things she did not yet understand but intended to. "Something's wrong with him," Birch said. "No," Ada said. "Something's wrong outside." Clara went to town. She went on foot, 3 miles along the frozen ridge trail, because she needed people to see her face when she told them. Not a note, not a message delivered through Levi. Her face. She started at the general store, where 4 men were gathered around the iron stove at the back, warming their hands and discussing the price of hay. She told them what the barometer had read. She told them what she expected it to read by nightfall. She told them that in her father's experience, a 12-point drop in 6 hours preceded the kind of storm that did not give warning twice. The oldest of the 4 men, a rancher named Sutton, listened with the polite patience of a man who intends to disagree. "Your father worked underground, Mrs. Voss. Things read different in a mine shaft. He worked above ground too," she said. "He read pressure for 30 years. "Animals don't predict weather," said the man beside him. "That's old wives' saying." "I'm not telling you what my dog thinks," Clara said. "I'm telling you what the instrument says." She went to the church and spoke to Reverend Hatch, who listened carefully and said he would mention it at Sunday service, which was 4 days away. She went to 3 more households. At each one, she was received with the same mixture of politeness and dismissal, the particular social transaction of people who do not want to be rude to someone they have recently wronged, but also do not want to be told what to do by a woman who lives in a cave. At the last house, she ran into Harlan Briggs. He was coming down the porch steps as she was coming up the path. They stopped a few feet apart in the January cold. His breath came in short white clouds. His eyes were steady and gave away nothing. "Mrs. Voss, Mr. Briggs." She kept her voice level. I came to ask the Hendersons to consolidate their firewood under the covered part of their barn and to move their livestock into the main stall together. There's a storm coming, a serious one." Harlan looked at her for a long moment. Not hostile, not dismissive, something in between. The look of a man who is considering something against his will. "I've built through worse winters than anything that barometer has ever read," he said. It was not spoken cruelly. It was stated the way Harlan stated most things, as fact, as the natural conclusion of 20 years of experience, as something he was telling her for her own benefit. He believed it completely. Clara looked at him. "I know you have," she said. "I hope that's enough." She walked back to the ridge. That evening, as she was banking the stove for the night, she heard a knock at the outer vestibule door. She opened it and found Levi Marsh standing in the dark with snow already beginning on his shoulders, though the sky had been clear an hour before. He came inside. He accepted the cup of tea she poured. He sat in the chair that had, over the past few weeks, become the chair he sat in when he came. The one nearest the stove, slightly angled toward the door, the way a man sits when he is comfortable but still keeping track of the exit. "How bad?" Clara asked. Levi wrapped both hands around the cup. "I came down from the North Ridge this afternoon. The pressure up there is lower than I've felt it in 30 years, maybe longer." He paused. "I've seen this once before. 1864. I was 19. We lost 14 cattle and 2 men that week. The fire ticked. Copper lay with his chin on his forepaws, his eyes moving between them. I went to town," Clara said. No one listened. "I know." He was quiet for a moment. "I came to tell you what's coming so you could be ready, not to tell you what to do about the rest of it." "I'm ready. I know that too." He set down the cup and stood. At the vestibule, he paused and looked back at the room. The stove, the radiant wall, the warm floor, the 2 children asleep under their blankets, Copper watching him with calm golden eyes. "There's room," Clara said. Levi looked at her. "If it gets bad enough," she said. "There's room." He nodded once, put on his hat, and stepped out into the dark. The storm arrived on the evening of January 6th. It did not announce itself. 1 hour the sky was clear and cold and full of hard stars. The next hour the stars were gone, replaced by a darkness that was different from ordinary darkness. Thicker, closer, with a pressure behind it that you felt in your ears before you heard anything at all. Then the wind came. It did not howl, the way people who have not lived in Wyoming imagine blizzards howl. It screamed. It was a high, sustained living sound, a sound that did not suggest wind so much as suggests something vast and indifferent moving through the world and not caring what was in its way. The Douglas fir on the ridge above the cave bent and thrashed and made sounds like wood tearing from the inside. Clara had banked the stove heavily that afternoon. 3 large logs, the channels packed, the radiant wall already holding 2 days of accumulated warmth. She had filled every container in the cave with water from the spring seep at the back of the chamber because she knew that once the storm settled in, going outside for anything would become a question of survival rather than convenience. The temperature outside dropped to 23 below in the first 2 hours. By midnight it was 38 below, and still falling. Clara knew this because Levi had left her a second thermometer, an outdoor one mounted in the vestibule on the outer wall, the previous week, without comment, without instruction. She had understood what it was for. Inside, 78 degrees. She did not sleep. She sat with her back against the warm wall and listened to the storm work on the ridge above her, and she thought about the 14 families in Delward burning through their wood at twice the rate they had planned for, and she thought about Harlan Briggs's north-facing wall, which she had studied the one time she had been inside his cabin and which she had known, in the way you know things you have been taught to see, was going to be a problem before this winter was over. She thought about the Cutter family. Their cabin was the finest in the southern part of town. Harlan had built it himself 5 years ago, his best work, he had said so more than once. Plank walls, mortise and tenon joints, a chimney he had laid stone by stone. A good cabin. A cabin that had survived 4 winters without serious trouble. She thought about what 4 winters of maximum burn did to a chimney's mortar joints in a climate like Wyoming's. The freeze and thaw cycles, the expansion and contraction of stone and clay, and the slow, inevitable widening of the gaps between them. She did not want to be right about the Cutter cabin. She was right about the Cutter cabin. The fire started at midnight. The chimney had been running at maximum capacity for 19 hours when the mortar joint on the 3rd course above the roofline finally gave way. The gap was small, barely a 1/4 inch. But at the temperature, the flue gases were running. A 1/4 inch was enough. Sparks found the gap. The gap found the dry timber of the roof framing. The timber found the rest of the cabin in less time than it takes to tell. The Cutter family woke to smoke and heat of the wrong kind. The kind that eats instead of warms. They came out through the front door barefoot into snow that was 38 below zero. All 6 of them in their night clothes, with nothing. No coats, no boots, no blankets. Neighbors came quickly, because in a town that small a fire at midnight brings everyone out into the cold, and they came with blankets and with what warmth they could offer, and no one died in the fire or in the snow outside it. But the youngest Cutter child, a girl of 4 named Lily, had been the last one out, and her feet had been bare on the snow for 4 minutes before anyone thought to pick her up. 4 minutes at 38 below. She would live. Clara would learn this later, and the relief of it would be genuine and complete. But the damage to Lily's feet was already done in those 4 minutes, in a cold that did not negotiate and did not wait. The doctors in Casper would do what they could. It would not be enough to undo everything. One small toe on her left foot would not survive the frostbite. This was the cost of a warning not heard. Clara did not know any of this yet. She sat in her cave and listened to the storm and felt the warmth of the walls around her. And she did not know about the fire, or about Lily Cutter, or about what was already beginning to make its way through the drifts toward the limestone ridge. Birch was the one who heard it first. He had been sleeping so deeply that Clara had checked his breathing twice, placing her palm near his mouth to feel the soft exhale, the way mothers do when children sleep too still. He woke suddenly at 1:30, sat up, and turned his head toward the vestibule with the alert, focused expression of a child listening to something specific. Mama. Clara was beside him in 2 steps. "Someone's outside," he said. Copper was already at the vestibule door, not growling, not aggressive, standing squarely in front of it with his tail still and his ears forward. Waiting. Clara put on her coat and opened the inner door. Through the outer door, she could hear nothing over the storm, but Copper pressed forward, certain, and Clara opened the outer door against the force of the wind and looked out into the darkness and the driving snow. Reverend Solomon Hatch stood 2 feet from the entrance. His coat was sheeted with ice. His hat was gone. His face, in the dim light that spilled from the open door, was the particular grayish white of a man who has been outside in this for long enough that his body has begun to make calculations about what it can afford to continue warming. He could not speak. His jaw was moving, but nothing was coming out, and Clara understood that this was not from shock, but from cold. His face muscles had stiffened past the point of easy use. She stepped aside. "Come in," she said. "Close the outer door behind you." He got the door. He stood in the vestibule for a moment, and then Clara opened the inner door, and the warmth hit him the way warmth hits a person who has been without it long enough to forget what it feels like a physical force, like something pressing back against the cold that had settled into his bones. He made a sound, not a word, something lower than a word. Something that came from further down than language. Clara guided him to the chair by the stove. She poured water into the tin pot and set it to warm. Ada was awake, sitting up in her blankets, watching with the calm competence of a child who has learned that crises are managed rather than survived. "Ada," Clara said. "Blanket." Ada brought the extra blanket from the trunk and draped it around the Reverend's shoulders without being asked to do it in any particular way. She did it correctly, efficiently, and then stood back and let her mother work. It took 20 minutes for Hatch to be able to speak. When he could, he said, "The church lost 2 windows on the north face. The Henderson barn is gone. The roof came down. I don't know about the rest. How did you get here?" "The ridge trail. I've walked it in the dark before." He paused. I remembered where it was. Clara handed him the warmed water. He held the cup in both hands and did not drink immediately, just held it, letting the heat move from the tin into his palms and from his palms into the rest of him. "I should have listened to you," he said. "Drink the water, Reverend. Mrs. Voss." "The water," she said, not unkindly. "We can talk when you're warm." He drank. He was not the last to arrive that night. An hour after Hatch, the outer door sounded again. Clara opened it to find the Cutter family, all 6 of them, clustered in the entrance, wrapped in borrowed blankets that the neighbors had pressed on them, still in their nightclothes beneath. Emmett Cutter, who was 40 and had never in Clara's memory asked anyone for anything, looked at her with the expression of a man whose face has finished pretending. "Our cabin's gone," he said. "The children—" "Come in," Clara said. "All of you." Little Lily Cutter was in her father's arms, wrapped in 2 blankets, her face buried in his neck. Clara saw the feet as Emmett carried her past. The particular white-gray color at the toes that she recognized from her father's descriptions of cold injury in the mines. She did not say anything about it yet. There was nothing useful to say about it yet. She made room. She reorganized the space with the focused efficiency of someone who has already thought about this problem, because she had thought about this problem. In the abstract, sitting alone at night, when the storm was still a number on a barometer and a feeling in the air. Sigrid and Oscar Thorne arrived 40 minutes later, their sod house having taken on water through the frozen roof when the weight of the new snow collapsed a section of it. Sigrid came through the door with ice in her eyebrows, and Oscar behind her carrying their bundled possessions, not many, and stopped when she felt the warmth and stood very still for a moment with her eyes closed. "God," she said softly, in a way that was not profanity. Dora Spence came alone, an hour before dawn, without explanation. She stood in the vestibule and looked at Clara and opened her mouth and then closed it again. Clara stepped aside and Dora came in and found a space along the wall and sat down and did not speak for a long time. 2 young men from the south end of town arrived with a third between them. A boy of about 17 who had been caught outside when the storm hit, and who was conscious but moving in the slow, deliberate way of someone whose body is making decisions without consulting his mind. Clara sat him near the stove and had Ada bring the extra blanket and told the 2 men to take off his boots. And they did, finding the feet inside already past color. She worked through the night. 19 people in a room 14 feet long and 10 feet wide, and the stove held, and the walls held, and the temperature did not drop below 72 degrees. She organized blankets and floor space with the same methodical patience she had used to plan the cave's construction, calculating what was available, what was needed, where things should go. She heated water constantly, in the tin pot and in the small cast iron pan, because warm water was what the cold injured needed, and the cold injured needed it in a particular sequence that her father had taught her from his years in the mines. Not hot. Warm. Hot water on frostbitten flesh caused more damage than the cold had done. Warm water, slow rewarming, patience. At some point in the night, Lily Cutter's hand found its way out of the blankets and came to rest against Copper's side. The dog did not move. That was enough. Clara watched this from across the room and felt something shift in her. Not relief exactly, not yet, but the early intimation of it. The sense that the worst of the night was still ahead, but that the night would end. She added 2 logs to the stove at 4 in the morning, banking them carefully, adjusting the channel draw, and then sat with her back against the warm wall and looked at the 19 people arranged across the floor of the cave she had built from salvaged lumber and clay and a principle her father had taught her when she was 11 years old. Birch was asleep against her side. Ada was asleep on the other side of the room, her book still open on the floor beside her, her hand resting on the page she had been reading before her eyes had finally given up. Outside, the storm continued its work on the world. Inside, 74 degrees held steady, and the stone, as it always had, remembered every degree it had ever been given. Dawn came without color. The sky beyond the cave entrance lightened from black to a gray so pale it was almost white, and the storm did not soften with it. The wind continued its work on the ridge above, and the snow drove sideways past the entrance in sheets that made the Douglas fir invisible from 10 feet away. But inside the cave, the light changed, and the change was enough. The people on the floor began to stir. Clara had not slept. She had sat through the night with her back against the warm wall, adding logs at intervals she had calculated by feel rather than clock, managing the stove the way her father had managed his mine shafts, with continuous small adjustments rather than large interventions, with the understanding that consistency was more valuable than intensity. The room had held between 72 and 76 degrees through the coldest hours. The stove had asked for nothing dramatic in return. She rose at first light and began the work of morning. 19 people in a space built for 3 required a particular kind of organization. Not rigid, not managed with authority, but shaped quietly from the inside, the way a good stove shapes the temperature of a room without announcing itself. Clara moved among the waking bodies with the unhurried efficiency of someone who had decided, in the long hours of the night, exactly what needed to be done and in what order. Water first. She heated the tin pot and the cast iron pan simultaneously, filling them from the buckets she had drawn from the back seep the previous afternoon. The spring seep ran year-round along the deepest part of the cave wall. A slow, constant weeping of groundwater through limestone that never froze, never varied. One of the quiet miracles of the place that Clara had noted in her first week and never stopped being grateful for. The water came out at 48 degrees. Heated to the right temperature, it was exactly what the cold injured needed. The 17-year-old boy, his name was Fletcher, she had learned, the youngest son of a family that farmed 2 miles east, had slept through most of the night without regaining full coherence. She checked him first. His color had improved. His fingers, which had been a waxy yellow when he arrived, had moved toward pink in the night. The slow bloom of returning circulation that meant the tissue was intact. She heated water to just above body temperature, filled the extra basin she used for washing, and had one of the young men who had brought Fletcher hold the boy's hands in it for 20 minutes while she moved to the next problem, Lily Cutter. Emmett had not slept either. He sat against the wall with his daughter in his arms, in the same position Clara had last seen him at midnight, his face holding the careful blankness of a man who is keeping himself together through sheer force of will, because the alternative is not useful to the person who needs him. Lily was awake, watching the room with the large, quiet eyes she had worn since arriving. Clara knelt beside them. She did not look at Lily's feet yet. She looked at Lily's face first, and she spoke to the girl directly, the way she had learned children needed to be spoken to when they were frightened. Not around them, not above them, but to them, as though their understanding was the most important thing in the room. "Good morning," Clara said. "You slept well." It was not a question. Lily considered it. "I had a dream," Lily said. Her voice was small but steady. "What did you dream?" "Dogs." She looked at Copper, who had remained close to the Cutter family through the night, and was now sitting 3 feet away, with his ears forward, watching the conversation. He was in it. "He has that effect," Clara said. She examined the feet gently, carefully, with the experience of a woman who had read her father's mining reports on cold injury and committed the relevant sections to memory the way she committed everything her father had taught her, as practical knowledge to be stored against the day it was needed. What she found was consistent with what she had seen in the night. The 2 smallest toes on Lily's left foot were still without sensation, the tissue firm and pale in a way that meant the damage had gone deeper than the surface. She did not tell Emmett what she suspected. Not yet. What she did was rewarm the feet in the way she knew, slowly and carefully, with warm water and patience, in the particular steadiness of hands that are trying very hard not to communicate the fear behind them. Emmett watched her work. He said nothing for a long time. Then, quietly, so the children nearby could not hear, "How bad?" Clara met his eyes. "She needs a doctor. When the storm breaks." He nodded. His jaw worked. He nodded again. "She's warm now," Clara said. "She's safe now. That's what matters today." It was true. And it was also the only true thing that could be said. Sigrid Thorne appeared at Clara's elbow while she was banking the stove for the mid-morning burn. Sigrid was 43, a compact, capable woman who had homesteaded a sod house in Wyoming with her husband for 11 years, and had the particular quality of practical competence that comes to women who have been solving problems without resources for longer than seems reasonable. "What do you need?" Sigrid said. Not, "What can I do?" Not, "How can I help?" What do you need? The question of someone who understands that efficiency matters more than comfort in a crisis. Clara looked at her. Can you manage the water rotation? Keep the pot warm. Refill from the back seep when it gets below half. Don't let it boil. Yes. And the children need something to do. When they wake up properly, it keeps them from frightening each other. Sigrid looked at the collection of small bodies beginning to disentangle themselves from blankets across the floor. The Cutter children, 3 of them now moving, the youngest still with Emmett. She looked at Ada, who was awake and watching the room with her characteristic stillness, already calculating. Your daughter, Sigrid said. She's already doing it. Clara turned. Ada had positioned herself on the floor near the youngest Cutter boy, a child of 6 named Warren who had woken from sleep directly into confusion and was working his way toward crying. Ada had her collection of small stones, the ones she kept in the cedar box she used for lessons, spread between them on the warm floor. She was teaching Warren to sort them by weight, demonstrating the method with the focused patience of someone who has been taught that knowledge is the best thing you can give a frightened person because it gives them something to do with their hands. Warren was not crying. He was sorting stones. Clara turned back to the stove. The day organized itself around necessity the way days always do when necessity is clear enough. Water heated, passed, cooled, replaced. The cold injured monitored, rewarmed, monitored again. The people who were whole enough to help were put to use helping, because purposeful motion generated warmth, and because people who are helping do not have time to panic. The cave that had seemed impossibly small at 2 a.m. became, by midday, a space that functioned, not comfortably, not without cost, but functionally, which was the only standard that mattered. Reverend Hatch sat near the inner door through most of the morning. He was recovered enough by midday to be useful, and he was useful in the way that a minister is useful in a contained crisis, not through physical labor, but through the steadiness his presence created. He spoke to people. He sat with Emmett Cutter for a long time, saying nothing at first, and then saying something quietly that Clara could not hear, and she did not need to hear it. The quality of Emmett's stillness changed. Not better exactly, but less alone. At some point in the mid-afternoon, Dora Spence came to stand beside Clara at the stove. She had spent most of the morning sitting against the wall, doing the small, useful things that came to hand. Holding a child while its mother slept, keeping a water cup filled, passing blankets, without speaking to anyone directly. She was not avoiding Clara. She was working up to something. Clara recognized the process. She had seen it before, in the long weeks after Edmund's death, when people who had not known what to say had eventually arrived at something. Dora looked at the stove. She looked at the warm floor. She looked at the radiant wall of river stones behind the stove, which was radiating heat with the steady generosity of something that has been storing up for weeks and is finally allowed to give. I should have come back, Dora said. Clara stirred the coals with the iron rod. Yes, I was afraid of what people would think. If I kept coming here, after... She stopped. After Harlan started talking. I know. That's not... Dora stopped again. Started differently. It wasn't right. I knew it wasn't right when I was doing it. And I did it anyway. Because being right about what's kind is easier than being right about what's convenient. And I chose convenient. Clara set down the iron rod. She looked at her friend, at the face she had sat across from on Sunday afternoons, at the eyes that were earnest and ashamed in equal measure, and not trying to hide either. "You're here now," Clara said. It was not absolution. It was not quite forgiveness. It was acknowledgment, the recognition that what a person does in the difficult moment matters more than what they failed to do in the comfortable one. Clara was not ready to forgive the months of silence yet, and she was not going to say she was. But Dora was here, in the storm, in the cave, and that was real, and it counted. Dora nodded. She went back to the water rotation without another word, and she worked steadily until dark. The moment with Lily happened in the late afternoon. The girl had been quiet all day, not distressed, not frightened, but contained in the way of a child who is processing something too large for her current vocabulary. She had eaten the thin porridge Clara made from the grain she kept in the cave storage. She had watched the room with her serious eyes. She had allowed herself to be held by her father and her mother in turns, but she had not spoken much, and the adults around her had given her the space of it, understanding that some things need to be sat with before they can be said. Copper had stayed close to the Cutter family all day. He was not performing comfort in the way that dogs sometimes perform things. He was simply present, the way he was always simply present, his body available, his warmth available, his calm available to whoever needed it. He lay beside Emmett for a while. He lay beside the older Cutter children while they slept after lunch. And in the late afternoon, he lay down beside Lily, who was propped against the cave wall with her feet wrapped and her hands loose in her lap. The room had quieted. Most of the adults were resting. Hatch was asleep sitting up, which Clara had not thought was possible, and had apparently been wrong about. The Thorn children, Sigrid had 2, both under 10, were asleep against their mother. Dora was awake, but still. Emmett had his eyes closed, though Clara did not think he was truly sleeping. Lily looked at Copper for a long time. Then she moved her hand from her lap and placed it on his side, careful, tentative, as though she was not entirely sure of her welcome. Copper breathed. Lily's hand rose and fell with him. She looked at her hand on the dog's flank for a moment. Then she looked up and found Clara across the room, and she said, in a voice that was not quite a whisper, but was close to one, "Is he cold too?" The room, without having been loud, became quieter. Clara looked at the girl. "Not anymore," she said. "He was cold once. Now he lives here." Lily considered this. Her hand continued to move slowly with Copper's breathing. "I'm going to get a dog," she said. It was not a question. It was a decision, stated with the quiet finality of a 4-year-old who has made up her mind. "I think that's a good plan," Clara said. Something broke in Emmett Cutter's face. Not dramatically, not with sound, just a quiet collapse of the control he had been maintaining since midnight, a release of tension across his jaw and around his eyes that he turned away to manage, pressing his face briefly into his wife's hair, his shoulders moving once and then going still. Mrs. Cutter put her hand on his back. Nobody mentioned it. That was how it was handled. The way most hard things in those years were handled, with the dignity of pretending not to notice what needed to remain private, and the grace of staying close enough to be felt. After the children slept, the adults were quiet in the way that people are quiet after a long collective effort. The specific exhaustion of people who have been useful for many hours and have run through the other side of it into something that is almost peace. Hatch sat awake again near the door. Sigrid and Oscar Thorne sat together with their shoulders touching. Dora had her eyes closed, but her breathing was not quite the breathing of sleep. Clara was banking the stove for the night when Levi came and crouched beside her. He had been there all day, present in the background in the way he was always present, doing the physical work that needed doing without being asked, refilling the water buckets from the back seep, repositioning people's belongings so the floor space made more sense, checking the vestibule doors at intervals to make sure the seal was holding. He had not drawn attention to any of it. Now he crouched beside her in the stove light, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him separate from the warmth of the room, and he watched her hands on the iron rod. "Fletcher's going to be all right," he said quietly. "His color's been good since noon. I know. Lily." He stopped. "I know," Clara said again. They were quiet together for a moment. The stove ticked as the channels expanded with heat. Outside, the storm was still working, though with slightly less of the screaming quality it had carried through the night. Less voice, more weight, the difference between a thing announcing itself and a thing settling in. "You planned for this," Levi said. It was not an accusation. It was not entirely a compliment. It was the observation of a man who has watched something be built correctly and is recognizing the correctness of it. "I planned for the storm," Clara said. "I didn't plan for 19 people." "No." He was quiet for a moment. "But you planned for them anyway. The seep, the extra grain, the extra blankets in the trunk." He paused. "A person doesn't keep 2 extra blankets in a trunk for themselves." Clara set down the iron rod and looked at the stove door. She had not thought of it that way. She had thought of it as the habit of a woman who had been taught to anticipate what might be needed, to store against contingency, to build for more than the immediate situation required. Her father's habit, passed to her without her noticing, it had been passed. Maybe that was the same thing. Levi's hand was on the floor between them, not reaching, not placed deliberately, just resting, open, the way a person's hand rests when they are relaxed and not guarding anything. Clara looked at it for a moment. Then she placed her own hand beside it, not quite touching, close enough to feel the warmth. They stayed that way for a while. Neither of them spoke. The stove worked quietly behind its door. The people on the floor breathed in the steady rhythm of exhausted sleep. Birch, who had been asleep against the wall for 2 hours, chose this particular moment to roll over, open his eyes, and look across the room at his mother and Levi with the frank, unguarded attention of a 5-year-old who has not yet learned to pretend he does not notice things. He looked at them for a moment. Then he said, to no one in particular, "Levi stays." He rolled back over and went to sleep. Levi looked at the wall in front of him. After a moment, the corner of his mouth moved. Clara looked at the stove. "He does say what he means," she said. "He does," Levi agreed. Sometime near midnight, Birch woke again. He sat up and looked around the room with the alert, slightly bewildered expression of a child who has woken in a familiar place that is currently full of unfamiliar people. He looked at the bodies arranged across the floor, the blankets, the sleeping faces in the dim stove light. He looked at Copper, who had stationed himself near the door as though on guard duty, and who acknowledged Birch's wakefulness with a brief tail movement and nothing more. Birch turned to Clara. "Are these our people now, Mama?" He asked it the way he asked most things, simply, without self-consciousness, as though the question were obvious, and the answer would be too. Clara looked around the cave, at Reverend Hatch, asleep sitting up with his chin on his chest. the man who had almost written a report that would have taken her children away and had not, and who had walked 3 miles in a blizzard at midnight because he had nowhere else to go and knew she would open the door. At Emmett and his wife, asleep finally, with Lily between them, Copper pressed against Lily's side. At Dora, who had come alone in the dark and not offered an explanation, and had worked all day without being asked. At the Thorne family, who would rebuild their house in the spring using principles Clara would help them understand. At Fletcher, who would wake tomorrow with his color restored and his hands intact, and a story he would tell for the rest of his life about the coldest night of 1892. At Ada, asleep with her book still open, her hand still on the page. At Levi, who had settled back against the wall and whose eyes were closed, but whose breathing was not quite the breathing of sleep. "Yes, Birch," she said. "I think they are." He nodded, as though she had confirmed something he already knew, and lay back down. Within 2 minutes, he was breathing the deep, absolute breath of a child who has no doubt about where he is or whether he is safe. Clara added 1 log to the stove. She checked the vestibule seal. She checked Fletcher's color. She straightened the blanket across Lily's shoulders without waking her. Then she sat back against the warm wall and listened to the storm outside, and to the breathing of 19 people inside, and to the quiet working of the stone around her, holding, as it had always held, everything that had been given to it. Outside, the temperature was 41 below. Inside, 73 degrees held. And the cave remembered every degree it had ever been warm. The storm broke on the 3rd day, not with drama, not with the sudden silence that people who have not lived through a blizzard imagine, the clean, cinematic moment when the wind stops and the world goes still. It broke the way most hard things break in Wyoming, gradually, grudgingly, with several false endings before the real one. The wind dropped to half its force, then picked back up, then dropped again, and each time it dropped, the people in the cave looked at each other and did not say anything, because saying it out loud felt like a way of inviting it back. On the morning of the 4th day, the wind was gone. The silence it left behind was enormous, not empty, full, the way silence is full after something loud has occupied a space for a long time. The Douglas fir on the ridge above stood still. The snow had stopped sometime in the night. The sky, when Clara stepped through the vestibule into the crystalline cold of a January morning in northern Wyoming, was the particular blue that only exists at altitude after a storm has scoured the air clean of everything soft. She stood at the cave entrance and looked at the world the storm had made. The drifts were 8 and 10 feet deep in the low places. The deer trail down the ridge was gone entirely, buried under a smooth white surface that gave no indication there had ever been a path there. The stand of Douglas fir was half buried, the lower branches pressed into the snow and invisible, the trees reduced to their upper thirds. 3 miles east, where Delward sat, a thin collection of smoke plumes rose into the cold blue air, fewer than there should have been, and thinner, the smoke of fires that had been running on the last of everything. Clara went back inside and began the work of getting people home. It took most of the morning. The snow was too deep and too unstable for the elderly or the injured to manage without help, and there were logistics to consider: who could walk, who needed support, in what order they should go so that the people most able to help arrived in town first and could assist those who followed. Clara organized this the way she had organized the night, without announcement, through the simple mechanism of deciding what needed to happen and beginning to make it happen, trusting that people who had spent 3 days in the same warm space would follow a clear lead. Levi and Oscar Thorne went first, breaking trail through the drifts with the deliberate, energy-conserving movements of men who understood that the goal was not speed, but sustainability. They returned an hour later and took the next group: Hatch, the young men, Fletcher, who was pale but steady on his feet, and embarrassed by his own weakness in the way of 17-year-old boys. Emmett Cutter carried Lily. He carried her the entire 3 miles, wrapped in 2 blankets, her face against his neck, her feet suspended and protected. His wife walked beside him. The other Cutter children walked in the track Levi and Oscar had broken in single file, without complaint. Copper walked beside Lily for the first quarter mile, matching Emmett's pace exactly, and then, when Clara whistled him back, returned to the cave entrance and sat watching until the Cutter family disappeared over the first rise. Clara watched them go. Lily would reach Casper 2 days later, when the road was passable enough for a wagon. The doctors would do what doctors in 1892 could do, which was not nothing but was not enough to undo the 4 minutes in the snow. The smallest toe on her left foot would not survive. She would walk without a limp. She would, in the years that followed, become the kind of person who notices when other people are cold and does something about it before they have to ask. Clara did not know any of this yet. She watched the Cutter family until they were gone, and she felt the sadness of it, clean and specific, the sadness of a harm that did not have to happen and happened anyway. She did not fold it into something larger or dress it in meaning it had not earned. It was what it was, a 4-year-old girl's foot, and the 4 minutes that made the difference, and the warning that had not been heard. This was the cost. It was real, and it was going to stay real. And Clara would carry it the way you carry the things you could not prevent. Not on the surface, where it would be visible and claim too much attention, but underneath, where it did its quiet work of keeping you honest. She went back into the cave and began to clean. The town came to her in the week that followed, not in a group, but in a stream, 1s and 2s, people arriving on the ridge trail with the careful, slightly altered expressions of those approaching a conversation they have prepared for and are no longer entirely sure they prepared correctly. Reverend Hatch came first, on the 2nd day after the storm. He came to the town meeting he had called himself, held in the church with the 2 north windows boarded over with scrap lumber, and he stood before the 43 families of Delward and said what he had to say. He had been wrong. He had allowed himself to be persuaded by a confident voice when he should have looked with his own eyes. He had very nearly used the authority of his office to separate a mother from her children on the basis of a judgment that the storm had made definitively false. He was sorry, not in the general, drifting way that public apologies often drift, specifically naming what he had done and what it had cost and what he intended to do differently. The room was quiet when he finished. Then Emmett Cutter, who was sitting in the 3rd row with his wife and his children, stood up and said that his family owed Clara Voss their lives, and that he intended to say so wherever and whenever it was relevant, and that he considered the matter of her judgment and her competence to be settled. He sat back down. Delward did not burst into applause. It was not that kind of town, and this was not that kind of moment. but something in the room shifted. The almost physical sensation of a collective opinion releasing its grip on a position it had been holding past the point of evidence. Clara was not at the meeting. She was at the cave, cleaning. Sigrid Thorne came to the ridge 3 days after the storm with her husband and a pot of venison stew, and an expression of focused purpose that Clara had come to recognize as Sigrid's baseline mode of operation. She set the stew down on the table. She looked around the room at the walls, the floor, the stove, the vestibule. She had spent 3 days inside this space. She had watched it maintain 72 degrees through the worst storm in a generation. She had felt the warmth come up through the floor planks and through the wall when she pressed her back against it. She was a practical woman, and practical women recognize practical things. "I want to learn how you built it," she said. "All of it. I want to understand the principle, not just copy the shape." "Sit down," Clara said. "This will take a while." They sat at the small table, and Clara drew on a piece of slate with charcoal, the way she had been taught to think through problems, in diagrams, in cross-sections, in the language of forces and materials, and the patient logic of physics that her father had pressed into her understanding before she was old enough to know it was unusual for a girl to be taught such things. She drew the double wall and explained why the gap mattered more than the thickness. She drew the floor system and explained the principle of cold air settlement. She drew the masonry stove channels and traced the path of the hot gases through the stonework, showing how the long path extracted heat that a straight chimney would have sent directly into the sky. Sigrid asked questions that were precise and practical, and never the same question twice. Oscar sat beside her and listened and made his own marks on a separate piece of slate. They stayed for 3 hours. When they left, Sigrid paused at the vestibule and turned back. "My husband wept," she said. "The first night we spent in the rebuilt house, when it holds the heat properly. He wept. He will not tell you this, but I wanted you to know." Clara looked at her. "He had been afraid for 11 years, Sigrid said. Every winter. Never said so. But I knew." She paused. "You took that away from him. A man should be able to sit in his own house without being afraid of it. You gave him that." She left. Clara stood in the vestibule for a moment after Sigrid's footsteps faded. Then she went back inside and added a log to the stove, because it needed one. Harlan Briggs came on a Thursday, 3 weeks after the storm. He came alone, in the middle of the morning, without announcing himself. Clara heard his boots on the rock, the same deliberate, unhurried walk she had heard the first time, in September, when he had come to tell her she was wrong. She did not go to the entrance. She waited. He came through the vestibule and stood in the room. He was wearing the same coat he always wore, his hat in his hands, his face holding the particular stillness of a man who has arrived at a decision through a process that cost him something and intends to see it through. He walked the room. He did what he had done the first time, ran his hand along the double wall, crouched at the base where the stone floor met the raised planking, stood before the masonry stove. But this time, the quality of his attention was different. The first time he had been looking for flaws. This time, he was looking at the thing itself, trying to understand how it worked. The way a craftsman looks at another craftsman's work when the pretense that it might not be good work has become unsustainable. He asked questions, precise, technical, carpenter's questions, the depth of the flue channels, the mortar composition for the radiant wall, the angle of the vestibule relative to the prevailing wind direction. Clara answered each one directly and completely, without editorializing, without the satisfaction of watching him receive information he had previously refused to consider. He was asking. She was answering. That was what was happening. He spent 20 minutes in the room. Before he left, he stopped at the double wall and pressed his palm flat against it. The same gesture Clara had seen him make the first time. But this time, he held it there longer, and his hand was still instead of exploratory. The gesture of a craftsman acknowledging craft, the only honest language he had, and he was using it. He turned toward the vestibule. "The channels," he said. "I would have run them shallower." He left. Clara stood in the center of the room for a moment. Then she sat down at the table and looked at the stove. She had not expected an apology. She had not gotten one. What she had gotten was Harlan Briggs walking through her door and asking her questions and listening to the answers. And for a man of his particular architecture, she understood that this was the equivalent of a great deal more than it looked like. Every cabin Harlan Briggs built after the winter of 1892 had thicker walls than the ones before, stone floors in the main rooms, masonry heaters instead of open iron stoves. When his clients asked why the change, he said the same thing, in the same flat voice of a man offering technical information: thermal efficiency, basic physics. He never said her name. Clara found the initials on a Thursday evening in March when she was packing the last of her belongings from the cave into the cart that would carry them to the small house she had built in town. Designed herself, modest, 1 story, 2 rooms, stone floor in the kitchen, thick walls, masonry stove. The warmest house she had ever built, which was saying something. She was doing a final pass through the room, checking the corners, the shelf, the space beneath the raised floor where Birch had once lost his red pebble, when she crouched beside the masonry stove to check the base seals and found it. Carved into the wooden frame beside the stove, at a height of about 2 feet from the floor. Done with a knife blade, in the careful hand of a man who was not accustomed to carving letters, and had taken his time with it anyway. H.B., December 1891. She sat back on her heels and looked at it for a long time. December 1891. Before the storm. Before the custody report. In the weeks when Harlan Briggs was still speaking against her at the general store, still moving through town with the confident authority of a man whose judgment had not yet been tested against reality. He had come to the cave. She thought about the night of the storm. 19 people in 72-degree warmth for 3 days, the stove performing exactly as she had calculated, the channels drawing cleanly, the joints holding, no failures of any kind in the most demanding conditions the structure would ever face. She thought about the flu incident in November, when the flue had jammed and she had cleared it and come back inside with hands too cold to hold a match. She thought about what she had checked the following morning, the mortar joints, the channel openings, the radiant wall, and what she had found. Everything tight, everything sealed, tighter than she had left it. She had attributed it to the cold. Materials contracting, settling, finding their final positions. She had not questioned it because she had not known to question it. Harlan Briggs had come to the cave in December of 1891, before the storm, while she was in town buying salt, while the children were at the Thorn place for the afternoon, while no one was watching the ridge. He had walked through the vestibule and into the room she had built, and he had gone to the stove, and he had looked at it the way he looked at every structure. with the eyes of someone who builds things for a living and cannot help but see what needs correcting. And he had corrected it, quietly, without telling anyone, without asking permission, without leaving anything behind except 2 initials and a date cut into the wooden frame at a height that suggested he had been crouching, close to the work, taking care. And then he had gone back to town and continued telling people she was wrong. Clara sat with this for a long time in the empty room. She thought about the kind of person who does a thing like that, who helps, secretly and practically and without acknowledgement, someone he is simultaneously and publicly opposing. She thought about what it meant, or what it might mean, and she arrived at something that was not quite understanding, but was in the neighborhood of it. Harlan Briggs believed she was wrong. He also, somewhere beneath the certainty, could not bring himself to let the work fail when he could see exactly what needed to be done to prevent it. These 2 things had existed in him at the same time, and he had acted on both of them in separate directions without resolving the contradiction between them. That was a kind of honesty, she thought, a strange, uncomfortable, incomplete kind of honesty, but honesty nonetheless. He had not been able to let 2 children go cold when he had the knowledge to prevent it, even while arguing, publicly, that they were not in danger. She stood. She looked at the initials one more time. Then she picked up the last of her things and walked through the vestibule and out onto the ridge. It was March. The snow was retreating from the south-facing slopes. Small brown patches of last year's grass were visible at the base of the limestone outcroppings, and the chokecherry bushes showed the first faint red of new growth along their stems. The Douglas fir stood still in air that carried, for the first time since October, something that might eventually become warmth. 3 miles east, Delward sat in the pale March light. The Cutter family was rebuilding, using plans that Clara had drawn for them on a sheet of brown paper. Double walls, stone floor, masonry heater, vestibule. Sigrid and Oscar Thorne were rebuilding too, with modifications that Oscar had designed himself based on the principle Clara had explained, adapted to the different conditions of a sod structure. Reverend Hatch had asked for drawings of the masonry stove design for the church, which lost more heat through its north wall than any building in Delward, and had always done so. Vera Briggs came to the cave on the last day, the day before Clara moved. She arrived in the late afternoon with a package wrapped in brown paper and tied with kitchen string. She came through the vestibule and stood in the nearly empty room, looking at the walls Clara had built, and the stove and the floor that still radiated warmth, though the fire had been banked low for days. She held out the package. Clara unwrapped it. Inside was a dress, made for Ada, blue cotton, the particular shade of a Wyoming sky in September, cut to Ada's exact measurements, the stitching careful and straight, the hem level, the collar finished with the kind of attention that takes hours and communicates something that words would handle less accurately. "This color suits her," Clara said. "I thought so," Vera said. "She has her mother's coloring." They stood in the entrance of the cave for a moment. Outside, the March light was going gold at the edges, the particular late afternoon light that arrives in northern Wyoming in early spring, like a rumor of something warmer coming. Vera touched Clara's arm. One touch, brief and certain, and then she walked back down the ridge toward the life she lived, which was complicated and not entirely of her own making, and which she was navigating as honestly as she could. Clara watched her go. Some things healed straight, Some things healed crooked. Both kinds of healing were real. Levi was waiting at the bottom of the ridge with the cart. He had offered to help with the moving, and Clara had said yes, which had surprised her slightly. The ease of saying yes, the absence of the calculation she had gotten used to performing before accepting help from anyone. She had said yes the way she imagined she had once said yes to things before Edmund died, and she had learned to do everything alone. He was leaning against the cart with his hat pushed back on his head, watching the ridge. And when she came down the trail with the last bundle, he straightened and took it from her without asking if she needed him to. "That's everything," he said. "That's everything." He looked up at the cave entrance, just visible through the Douglas fir, the narrow, dark opening in the limestone that most people in Delward had walked past for years without seeing. "What happens to it?" he said. "It stays," Clara said. "It doesn't need me here to do what it does." He considered this. "Trappers will use it." "I know. It'll keep them warm." "Yes." He looked at her. She looked at the cave entrance one more time. At the Douglas fir, the limestone, the narrow opening that had held her family through the coldest winter in 47 years, on 2 logs a day. She thought about what her father had written in the letter, "Shelter that the earth itself will defend." She thought about what August Keller had said at Edmund's grave, "The stone never lies about what it keeps." She did not feel the need to say anything else about it. The cave would say it for her, for anyone who came inside and stood still long enough to feel what the walls were doing. She turned away from the ridge and walked beside Levi toward the wagon road. "I was thinking," Levi said after a while, "about a porch on the east side of the new place. Better morning light." Clara looked at the road ahead. "Only if you stay to use it," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "I was thinking I might," he said. The porch went up that spring, on the east side of the new house, exactly where Levi had said. It caught the morning light the way he had promised it would, long and gold, and arriving before the rest of the day had made up its mind about what it intended to be. Clara sat on it most mornings before the children woke. She watched the ridge to the west, where the Douglas fir stood above the limestone in the early light, guarding an entrance that most people in Delward still walked past without seeing. The knowledge spread the way her father had always said practical knowledge spreads, not through argument or announcement, but through results. By the summer of 1893, 11 structures within 20 miles reflected the principle she had demonstrated. By 1897, the number was closer to 40. Nobody called it a system or a method. People simply said that the Cutter place stayed warm, or that the thorns hadn't burned through their woodpile since they rebuilt, or that the new schoolhouse, redesigned at Reverend Hatch's insistence, was the first building in Delward where the children in the back row removed their coats. Harlan Briggs built 12 more cabins in the years that followed. Every one of them had double walls. Everyone had a stone floor in the main room. Everyone had a masonry stove with channels long enough to do the work they were meant to do. His clients praised him for it. He accepted the praise with a nod and said nothing else. He never said her name, but the walls said it for him to everyone who was warm inside them. Copper died in the spring of 1906 on a Tuesday morning in April on the same warm floor beside the masonry stove where he had spent the better part of 15 years. He had gone gray around his muzzle and moved carefully in his last months, but he had continued to position himself near whoever in the house needed him most, which in his final weeks was Birch, who was 19 and preparing to leave for an apprenticeship in Casper and was not entirely ready to admit what leaving meant. Birch built the marker himself. A piece of Douglas fir, smoothed with a draw knife, the letters cut carefully with a chisel. Copper. He kept watch so we could sleep. 1890 to 1906. They buried him beside the cave entrance, in the shadow of the Douglas fir, in the ground that was just beginning to soften with the spring thaw. Ada stood with her hand on Birch's arm. Levi stood beside Clara. Nobody said much. Some losses are large enough that words make them smaller rather than larger, and all of them understood this. Birch became a builder. He apprenticed in Casper, returned to Delward at 22, and spent the next 30 years constructing the kind of structures his mother had taught him to think about, not just how they looked, but how they held. He had a particular specialty: houses for women who were starting over, widows mostly, women who had come into possession of a piece of land and a list of problems and not enough resources to solve all of them at once. He charged what they could afford, which was sometimes very little, and he made up the difference in other ways. When people asked him why, he said his mother had taught him that warmth was meant to be shared. When they pressed him on what he meant, he said that was all he meant, and changed the subject. Ada taught school for 31 years, in Delward, and later in 2 larger towns to the south. She taught arithmetic and reading and, when the curriculum allowed it, natural philosophy, what the students called science. Her favorite lesson involved a piece of limestone and a candle, and a simple demonstration of thermal mass that she had worked out herself from the principles her mother had explained to her when she was 9 years old, measuring a cave chamber with a length of rope. She never lost the habit of explaining things the way her mother had explained them, starting with the question rather than the answer, and trusting that a person who understands why something works will always know what to do with the knowledge. In December of 1929, Ada Voss, 47 years old, a widow herself now, her husband 3 years gone, walked the deer trail up the limestone ridge west of Delward for the first time in many years. The town had changed. The sawmill was gone. Half the original families had moved on. The general store had a new owner who stocked things that would have been unimaginable in 1891. The world had moved through itself in the way the world does, and most of what she had grown up with had been replaced by something newer and less certain. But the ridge was the same. The Douglas fir were taller, their lower branches heavier, their silence deeper. The limestone outcropping at the top of the trail still jutted from the hillside the same way it always had, like the knuckles of a buried fist. She found the entrance without trouble. Inside, the vestibule was still intact, weathered, the wood darkened with age, but standing. The inner door hung slightly open. She pushed it and stepped into the room her mother had built from salvaged lumber and clay and a principle learned in a Pennsylvania mine shaft. The double walls still stood. The raised floor had warped in places, the plank edges lifting where moisture had finally found a way in after nearly 40 years of seasons. The masonry stove was cold and dark, its firebox empty, its radiant wall still mortared tight. The natural fissure in the ceiling above it, the flue her mother had sealed so carefully, showed a thin line of gray December sky. Ada walked the room slowly. She pressed her palm against the double wall. The wood was cold. She crouched beside the masonry stove. She found what she was looking for without needing to search. On the wooden frame at a height of about 18 inches from the floor, in the unsteady hand of a 5-year-old boy with a nail and more intention than skill, was a horse. The legs were different lengths. The head was too large for the body. One ear pointed up and the other pointed sideways. The tail was a single curved line that might also have been a question mark. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. She sat on the cold floor beside it and looked at it for a long time. She thought about Birch at 5 years old, playing with his pebbles on the warm floor while their mother worked the mortar joints. She thought about the red pebble that was always getting lost behind the stove. She thought about the wooden horse their father had carved, and about Birch galloping it across this same floor, inventing rivers for it to cross. She thought about her mother sitting alone in this room in the winter dark, doing the calculation she could not win, and choosing to stay anyway. She pressed her palm flat against the cave wall. The limestone was cold beneath her hand, cold the way it had been cold in August of 1891, before her mother had stood in this same entrance and understood what cold limestone meant. Cold the way it was always cold, before it began to hold whatever warmth you offered it. She stayed until the light through the cave mouth went from gray to the pale gold of a Wyoming winter afternoon. Then she stood, touched the wooden horse one last time with the tip of one finger, and walked out through the vestibule into the cold. The Douglas fir stood around the entrance. The ridge fell away to the east, toward what remained of Delward, toward the house where her mother had lived for 30 years after leaving this cave, toward the porch on the east side that caught the morning light, toward everything that had come from this. She walked down the ridge toward town. Behind her, the cave held its silence the way it held everything, completely, without effort, without end. In December of 1904, Roland Fitch had written in his field notebook, "Structurally impossible by any standard I was taught." He had been right that it was impossible. He had been wrong about why. It was not impossible. It was simply built by someone who had been taught to ask a different question. Not, how do I make more heat? But, where is the heat going? Clara Voss died in March of 1931 at the age of 71 in the house she had designed herself, the one with the stone floor in the kitchen and the masonry stove and the east-facing porch where the morning light came in long and gold before the rest of the day had decided what it would be. She died in the room where she had lived, with Levi beside her and Ada and Birch and their children in the house, and the stove working quietly the way it had always worked, without drama, without demand, holding the warmth she had put into it, and releasing it slowly into the room where she lay. The stone never lies about what it keeps. The limestone ridge 3 miles west of Delward still stands. The Douglas fir are very old now, their trunks thick, their roots deep in the rock. The cave entrance is narrower than it was. The fir have grown close on both sides, their branches nearly touching above the opening. In winter, snow collects on the branches and falls in heavy clumps when the wind moves through, but the entrance stays clear. Inside, the room Clara built is still there. The double walls have settled into themselves over the decades. The clay between the planks dried and cracked, but still holding. The masonry stove stands at the back wall, its river stone surround intact. The mortar between the stones as solid as the day it was laid. Or nearly so. Nearly. There are places where a careful hand can feel the seams, the clay having found its final position, and stopped moving. On the wooden frame beside the stove, at a height of about 2 feet from the floor, 2 sets of marks are still visible. The initials HB and A date, cut with a knife blade in the careful hand of a man who was not accustomed to carving letters and had taken his time anyway. And below them, in the unsteady hand of a 5-year-old with a nail, a horse with legs of different lengths and a head too large for its body, and one ear pointing up and the other pointing sideways. The stone never lies about what it keeps.